This is Walter Bosley, and I'll be reading a selection from Roswell and the Reich by Joseph P. Farrell. The Nazi Scenario. Part 1. The Rationalization of the Documents, Bodies, and Debris. We have now reached the end of this study. As has been seen, the so-called independent Nazi scenario does make rational sense of all three major components of the Roswell incident. It makes sense of the major authentic documents that can reasonably be associated with that incident, and it even makes sense of some of the disputed ones. It even sheds a new interpretive light on the possible roles and motivations of some of those who have researched and written about the incident. There is, one may argue, a sense of urgency in those intelligence collection memoranda, as the U.S. Air Force evidently suspects the origin, much to its disbelief and chagrin, but is determined to discover exactly where they were coming from. It makes sense, too, of the data point of the bodies, for if one allows certain testimonies of their existence for the sake of argument, then, as Nick Redfern demonstrated in his book, the features recorded for those bodies are rationalizable on a wholly terrestrial basis. But most importantly, the original core of the story, the extraordinary debris, has now been shown to suggest not only something genuinely extraordinary, but also something genuinely terrestrial. In some cases, the details and properties of that debris pointed directly to the type of materials, engineering research, and fabrication that Nazi Germany was indeed pursuing. In others, a more speculative and argued case was made that ended in the same place. But in the final analysis, those remarkable properties point to nothing from the sky, but to hidden technologies, projects, and ideas right here on Earth. The documents, the bodies, and the debris have now been fully rationalized upon a terrestrial basis, and in the case of the documents and the debris, the indicators, if one has the eyes to see and the ears to hear them, are that the incident was caused by something Nazi crashing in the New Mexico desert. Would the U.S. military exhibit extreme anxiety and attempt to cover that up for political and technological reasons? Absolutely. The Nazi scenario fully rationalizes the peculiar Roswell dialectic evident in the incident almost from the beginning, and explains it as an attempt to control the interpretations of the event and to channel them into two mutually opposed and ultimately equally absurd interpretations. For self-evidently, mogul or weather balloon debris does not explain the debris as described by the witnesses. And equally absurd is the conclusion that the craft or its debris represented something extraterrestrial, for nothing really is known of its performance characteristics, nor its technologies beyond what has been described for the debris. To fall back on the wider ufological context is itself perilous to that interpretation, for while many of those reports described extreme performance for the period, none of them seem to this author exotic enough to compel toward the conclusion that they, or the Roswell incident itself, can only be explained by the conclusion that its origin was ultimately off this world. Section 2. The wider historical context. However, ufologists are not to be faulted for seeking to place their extraterrestrial interpretations of the Roswell incident into the wider ufological context of the period. This is a natural and rational step, given the paradigm by which they interpret the event. Similarly, it is a rational and natural step to seek to place a Nazi interpretation of the incident into a similar context. We have implied throughout this book that the Nazi scenario makes sense in a wider context that includes a kind of post-war paperclip détente, as it's called, that was struck between elements of the Anglo-American oligarchic elite and the elements of that surviving, post-war Nazi international. It makes sense of the growing suspicions of many researchers who have followed the subject that there is a kind of two space programs agenda, so to speak, being pursued, a public one and a much more secret one. As is now evident, the genesis of that idea historically was centered at the secret Nazi research center at Peenemünde itself, with the public secret program of von Braun and his rocket team, and the secret saucer programs of Fleischner, Epp, and others also being headquartered there. And straddling the fence between those two and the Nazi bell itself is Dr. Kurt Debus. The Nazi scenario makes sense of the subsequent silencing of the anti-gravity topic in the mid-1950s, just as well as does any extraterrestrial hypothesis. For faced with an enemy that was terrestrial and that had self-evident access to such technologies, the American military's response would have been a crash program to acquire it for itself. It makes sense even of the covert space and UFO wars, so to speak, that so many have noticed began to be waged between the American military and whomever, and makes sense of it without the absurd suggestion that the American military was willing to risk an interplanetary war with people that, by the nature of that case, possessed a technological capability far beyond our own, and brings it back to Earth, and to the suggestion that while they possessed an advanced technology, it was not so far beyond our own that it invited risk to the national security. There is one final detail to this scenario and two loose ends that must now be mentioned. In my previous books, I have argued that as the Second World War drew to its end, the Nazi leadership itself began a strategic evacuation plan that included as a principal feature of its planning the more or less equal division of its less sensational technological spoils between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, while retaining the best, most advanced, and most radical of those technologies for itself, for its own independent post-war development and exploitation. And that brings us to the two loose ends, the Czech Incident of 1946, and once again to Antarctica, and to Alternative 2. Section 3. The Czech Incident Revisited. In 1946, a team of American commandos surreptitiously entered Czechoslovakia for the ostensible purpose of recovering some 6 tons of documents that were necessary for the war crimes tribunals then taking place in occupied Western Germany. But as a close examination of American documents concerning that incident quickly reveal, the war crimes tribunal story was just a cover. For the Czech government protested that the commando team was simply trying to steal radar secrets and other technological data that had been buried by the SS somewhere in the environs of Prague. Even more tellingly, the American documents concerning the incident also contain the puzzling fact that no one within the American State Department or War Department could figure out just exactly who gave the orders for the incursion in the first place. There was genuine mystification. Perhaps one was dealing with one of the so-called pirate intelligence teams that so concerned General Eisenhower prior to the invasion of France. Or perhaps one might have been dealing with a team of German SS commandos dressed up like Americans and rescuing their own documents and pinning the blame on America in a classic false flag operation. Henry Stevens also imparts one more bit of information, for it is now believed that if the Americans were behind the commando incursion, and Stevens believes they most definitely were, then they did not get everything, for some 2.5 tons of so-called archival material remain under the control of former SS members and are still intact, according to Stevens. Given all that we have encountered in previous pages, it is a safe bet that the missing 2.5 tons of documents contained information about the Nazi atomic program, nuclear propulsion program, its saucers, and of course, the Bell Project. Section 4. Alternative 2, Antarctica Revisited. The other loose end is Antarctica. Alleged Nazi UFO proponents have long asserted, without much in the way of argumentation, that during the war a secret research base, a veritable city of Nazi technicians, engineers, and scientists, was constructed in Antarctica. This base, so the legend runs, continued conducting the most advanced Nazi research and utilizing Nazi flying saucers, and dealt a decisive defeat to Admiral Byrd and his Operation High Jump expedition in early 1947. There's that year again. While I have mentioned all of this in Reich of the Black Sun, I have long argued in public appearances and radio interviews that the construction of such a research base would have been a logistical impossibility for the German Navy during World War II. The Nazis may, and probably did, have some weather station and small U-boat base there, but an extensive research facility able to manufacture such craft? Ausgeschlossen. But once again, Henry Stevens has, as he so often does, dug much deeper, only to uncover a much deeper mystery. Quoting, "Geologically speaking, Antarctica is almost split in half by a huge rift valley which runs from the South Pole towards Africa, then up East Africa to the Dead Sea. This entire rift valley is overflowing with geothermal activity. It was on this very rift valley that the Germans located their Antarctic base. Hot water ponds, named the Schumacher Ponds by the Germans, are teeming with algae and found on surface rock deep within Antarctica. These ponds never freeze over. Interestingly enough, each pond is populated by a different species of algae, giving each pond a different color. It is not far-fetched to believe that a sustainable base could be located over one of these geothermal vents, especially deep within a large crevice or cave. The Icelanders rely on geothermal energy to produce electricity for their daily needs. Why could not have inhabitants of Antarctica?" End quote. Adding to the strangeness, Stevens reports that an anonymous letter was sent to the journal Scientific American in which a curious incident was alleged to have occurred in Antarctica. 2 Australian women were attempting to cross-country ski over Antarctica when they were seized by American Navy Special Forces and detained. The detention may have something to do, argues Stevens, with all the strange secrecy that the United States shows towards Lake Vostok, a vast underground thermal lake in the Antarctic interior, covered with an ice dome that, during the endless day of the Antarctic summer, admits enough sunlight to bathe the lake in an endless twilight glow of light coming through the ice dome. But why was no less than the American National Security Agency involved? Stevens maintains that it is because Admiral Byrd and the Nazis may have found or discovered something there during their 1938 and 1947 flyovers and photo reconnaissance of the continent. This may very well be the truth, for there is a huge magnetic anomaly on the southwestern shore of Lake Vostok, registering some 1,000 nanoteslas of variance with the surrounding vicinity. This might be due, as Stevens argues, to the presence of a vast amount of metal as in a buried city. Or perhaps a genuine geophysical anomaly, or a buried something else, or some combination of all three. We will never know. But the evidence, Stevens argues, points to something artificial and something, moreover, under intelligent control. Consider, he says, the following Antarctic Seismographs. These readings were taken from the American station at the Amundsen South Pole Station, whose seismometers are located in such a fashion that they are surrounding the old German area called New Schwabenland. The first graph is that of a typical all quiet on the Antarctic front sort of day. The second graph shows an Antarctic earthquake on seismograph. But then there appears to be, according to Stevens, highly anomalous, as in not naturally caused, standing long wave activity when the needles are all over the chart in what is definitely not an earthquake, nor, for that matter, an explosion of any sort. As if that were not enough, then there are signatures both of these standing long waves and of small sharp anomalies that would be typical of the seismic signatures of nuclear detonations. Stephen cites the research of German seismic researcher Christian Saul, who interprets this to be an American attack on New Schwabenland using the new boring atomic weapon announced at the time of the Iraq invasion. Moreover, adding credence to this idea, the date on the first seismograph depicted here is 3/20/03, the very day the United States began its massive bombardment of Baghdad. Saul maintains that while the world's attention was diverted to Iraq, the USA used bunker-busting atom bombs to attack the Nazi base. The defense, according to Saul, apparently held because there was a second such attack launched, as is allegedly demonstrated by the second seismogram. Stevens, of course, is much more skeptical, though concedes the overall importance of the seismograms. Quoting, "I really don't know if Christian Saul's interpretation is correct or not. What is most important to me is that there is real data here that shows something unusual and unexplained by the authorities. This hard seismological data, an acknowledged mystery lake in the center of Antarctica, and the interjection of the National Security Agency all point to something as yet unexplained happening on our southernmost continent." End quote. Whether or not the current activity has anything whatsoever to do with Nazis or their nefarious schemes is, in a certain sense, not even important, for it seems hardly coincidental that they would have chosen to explore precisely this area, nor coincidental that they also researched the very technologies of standing long waves evidenced in the seismograms. And whether these seismic anomalies point to secret buried cities, to a flying saucer long ago buried under the Antarctic ice, or to geophysical processes understood by but a few, or to some combination of any of these, one fact remains, and that is, within the wider context of Nazi saucer research and all the other exotic technologies that remained in their hands after the war, perhaps, after all, there might be a kernel of truth in the old mythologies of the last Nazi battalion, Antarctica, and secret saucer bases. In any case, we know now that the Roswell incident was not a silly balloon, and we know it was not extraterrestrial either. It was in all likelihood something Nazi, an enemy fighter that, as Admiral Byrd put it to the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio earlier that year in 1947, could fly from pole to pole with tremendous speed. And the United States, he advised, had best get busy and start preparing to defend itself. And that is what the record shows that it did. This is Walter Bosley, and I've just read a selection from Roswell and the Reich by Joseph P. Farrell.